Notebook on Cities and Culture's Korea Tour is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, David Hayes, and Polar Inertia Journal, an outlet for artists and researchers documenting the urban condition at polarinertia.com. What aspect of Korean culture influenced the names of your cats?
The names of my
Cats.
cats. Oh, how did you find out about that? You have done your research. I have two cats, and they've both got two names. They were called in English Samson and Delilah, because my daughter at that time was going to an international school run by, as most international schools are here, very right-wing, very, very Christian Americans. We want to give them Korean names too, which they've become a little bit better known for. And those names are makgeolli for the cat who's sort of gingery brown, and makgeolli for the cat who's snow white. They're from the same litter, but they're different colours. Makgeolli in Korean, in English, would be beer. And makgeolli is a Korean drink, which is basically a Korean traditional beer or ale made from rice. It's a rice brew. So that name always gets a laugh from Koreans. But the aspect of Korean culture, of course, is that Koreans, to their credit, and it's really rather charming, do like a tipple or two. There's a very, very strong drinking culture here. I think the one thing that surprises many people when they come to Seoul is what an exciting, fun city it is. It really is 24/7. It's loud, it's zany, it's noisy, it's in your face. It's a great place to go out drinking in, compared to, say, London, which is my hometown, which is an incredibly dull city by comparison. And, Britain, we like drinking, but I don't think we drink as much, and we aren't able to drink for as long as Koreans seem able to do. So, does that answer the question?
Certainly. The drinking culture is one of the many aspects of Seoul here that I enjoy, which is where we're sitting, by the way, Seoul, South Korea, on Notebook on Cities and Culture today. I'm speaking with a man who's been reporting on all aspects of Korea from, let's see, even in just book form, the food, its military history, its economic history. He writes about all things Korean. He's got a new book on the way about, it's a guide to all that matters about Korea. It's Andrew Salmon. You may have seen his columns if you're interested in Korea. You keep up with the Korean media. Surely if you're reading about Korea in English, you've come across something from him and something probably provocative from him. I don't know. Are you associated with any particularly provocative positions here in Korea?
One position I do tend to take, which is very anti, I think, the position most Koreans take, is I think the Koreans are a little unfair towards the Japanese.
As I sit here near the Japanese embassy with lots of accusatory things staring right at the embassy.
Yeah, exactly. There's always some sort of protest outside the Japanese embassy over real or alleged, usually historical misdemeanors, and moreover about Japan's alleged lack of contrition for these historical misdemeanors, or indeed some pretty horrific crimes and atrocities. But the irony, of course, is that Korean nationalism, which is an extremely emotive, strong, powerful force across the body politic, was incubated under Japanese colonialism and actually appeared as a result of Japanese colonialism and was afterwards leveraged by the authoritarian governments as a unifying force and as a spur for economic development, and is now very, very deeply embedded in Korean culture. And I think 10 years ago, if we're talking where is Korean nationalism aiming its guns, would have said at the Americans. Anti-Americanism was very, very strong. Anti-Americanism has waned in recent years, but anti-Japanesism has waxed mightily. And right now, it's Japan and Korea does not have a defender. There's no one who's prepared to stand up and say, hang on, okay, granted, some things the Japanese do are unreasonable, but what about us? Are we doing unreasonable things? Are we pushing these issues fairly? Are we being disingenuous about some of the things we say? For example, the Japanese have apologized over 50 times for past atrocities. They have attempted, at least, to pay compensation to the comfort women, and many of these facts are simply either unknown or are ignored by Koreans, because there is, as I said, there's a strong sense of nationalism here. There's also there are some elements in the body politic, some of the NGOs who have very much a vested interest in keeping this sort of burning anti-Japanese feeling alive and well. So that's, in the last year or two, I suppose that's perhaps a slightly provocative stance I've taken. Although that having been said, I think it's a reasonable fact-based stance. I've also been reading a great deal about the Holocaust over the last couple of years, and to compare the industrialized genocide which the Nazis instituted in, say, Poland and Eastern Europe, to the Japanese colonization of Korea, I think, they're very different things. And I think many Koreans don't really get that point. They don't deploy historical relativity in their attitudes towards Japan in the past.
Now, anybody who comes here to Korea to visit, or indeed who visits Los Angeles' Koreatown, where I live, they'll encounter many materials, be they posters, be they videos in coffee shops, be they billboards, signs on subways about an island called Dokdo. And they will seem very emphatic and for seemingly no reason to somebody who doesn't know what the situation is. Why there are these kind of meaningless rocks to somebody who's just learns what they are at first in the middle of the ocean. But it turns out they're very meaningful rocks to the Koreans. They're always talking about, Dokdo는 우리 땅, like it's there, it's our land, it's our land, it's our land, it's our land. Soon you realize they mean by that it's not the Japanese land. But what do you make of the Dokdo situation? I mean, there's no Japanese there, are there? Is there any active Japanese movement?
Japanese there. I think they set up a signaling station there, perhaps in 1905, as part of their fleet early defense, early warning systems when they were fighting the Russians. No, Dokdo are two islets in what we call the Sea of Japan, what Koreans insist should be called the East Sea, i.e. the sea between Korea, the Korean Peninsula and Japan. They're about equidistant, and there are both the Japanese and the Koreans have got a huge range of documents and historical materials claiming, we own it because this was said in such and such a year. De facto, of course, they're held by Korea. Korea is never going to let them go. They've got a company of armed police on the islands. They frequently have marine exercises there. I think last year they even had a special forces landing exercise there. So there's just no way the Japanese are ever going to get it. Of course, the Japanese being involved in various other disputes around the region over disputed territory islands, basically, with China, Taiwan, and Russia, they can't afford to let this go on principle. So the Japanese do claim Dokdo, they can call it Takashima, periodically. And yet the Koreans take this incredibly personally, even though they're the ones who hold it. And they're much more emotive about it than the Japanese. I think it's fair to say most Japanese had really never heard of what they call Takashima up until 2008, which is when President Lee Myung-bak became the first Korean president ever to visit this disputed island. And suddenly the Japanese realized, previously the only Japanese who had been interested in this issue were, I think, the people in the foreign ministry who had to be interested in it, and sort of fairly hardcore nationalists. And suddenly you got a Korean president visiting it, suddenly it blows up as a major issue. So in a sense, that kind of backfired. But yeah, it's one of these very, very emotive issues which most of us think, well, why are the Koreans so concerned about it, given they hold it? But it's when the Japanese are involved, sometimes the rationality gets put on the back burner and the emotion comes to the fore.
I mean, I've heard Korean friends say things like, I just want to go to Dokdo myself to see it. I just want to be... So what do you want? I've seen pictures of Dokdo. It's hardly hospitable.
I've been to Dokdo. I was taken there by a group of foreign journalists, taken there by a very hospitable Coast Guard corvette several years ago. And they're not, by any stretch of the imagination, beautiful islands. They're literally rocks which, throughout most of their history, up until just the last few years, have been completely uninhabited. But they're a bone of contention between Japan and Korea, which means they're a flame of national identity, nationalism. You don't just see them on billboards and posters. You see them, you go to public buildings, there will be television screens running live feeds from Dokdo and so on.
Nothing ever changes, but the important thing is there's a live feed of Dokdo, our land.
Yeah, exactly. So if this island was not disputed, with Japan, no one would have the slightest bit of interest in it. It's got absolutely zero economic value. It's got very, very little historical value apart from its name. But because the Japanese want it and the Koreans have got it, it is an issue.
Yeah, nobody needs Dokdo, ultimately. There's no advantage there's no non-symbolic advantage to Dokdo.
I mean, as far as I'm aware, there's people talk there may be underground energy deposits, maybe some rich fisheries around there, but I don't really think this is an economic argument. It's an emotive argument.
Now, we are sitting, of course, far from Dokdo, in a place very different, in Seoul, which, as you say, a 24-hour city, convenient place, everything is here. What was Seoul like when you first saw it in 1989?
Oh, yeah, no, that's a good question. I came here and I was fascinated by Korean martial arts, so I wanted to practice those. That's why I came originally as a backpacker. I mean, the first thing that struck you was what a drab, miserable-looking place Seoul was. Everything was square, grey, blocky. The people, I was struck by how fierce they were. We have this, rather ridiculous and outdated belief that, of course, the Asian people are very polite and self-effacing and bow to each other all the time. And this was just a very superficial belief I had at the time, based on, again, superficial beliefs about the Japanese. But of course, Korea was totally different. People were very, very busy. They were fast-moving. You'd walk down the street where people just literally crash into you all the time. Everyone was spitting, hawking, talking fast. I frankly found Koreans very, very rude, very difficult to get on with. And the funny thing was, all the foreigners, they lived in a virtual state of siege. If you met a foreigner on the street, you'd almost shake hands, start talking to each other, and you had an immediate common topic of conversation. What a dreadful place Seoul is.
Yes. Why are we here?
Exactly. Why are we here? This was the question you'd ask each other when you're getting out. How long have you been here for? Now, I mean, I think the situation has moved radically from Koreaphobia to Koreaphilia. You meet foreigners here now and say, what a great city this is to be in. It's a lot of fun. The current Korean generation, the young Koreans, are very international, very, very friendly, very lively. The city is beautified massively since those days. I mean, still the architecture is pretty modern.
30-story towers.
Yeah, exactly. But there's been a huge interest now since, I guess, around the turn of the millennium in lifestyle, in quality of life. When I first came here, the primary Korean virtue was diligence. Oh, you work hard. That was the thing to say. Well, what are your interests? What are your hobbies? No, sleeping. That's all I have time to do. No one had time for leisure.
Drinking?
Drinking. Drown your sorrows. Nowadays, people understand quality of life. They understand lifestyle. They understand, life is not just for working, it's for living. So Korea, I think, has changed radically in a very, very beneficial, appropriate and positive way. Now it's almost a joy to live here.
And a lot of that change, correct me if I'm wrong, but it must have come not just from 1989 to now, but since you came here to live in 1998 until now. That's even more change in that window than those first 89 to 98 years, right?
Yeah. I think, Korea, one thing one can say, one constant about Korea is its changeability. This country has a tremendous ability to absorb and implement change. And, literally, you go away from Korea for a year. When you come back, some things will change. But you never used to see any form of diversity, architectural diversity, cultural diversity, racial diversity, even diversity of attitudes. People tended to think and say the same things. That has changed radically. And I think this has been a long-term process. You had democratization in the late 1980s, 87, 88, and this starting to take a real grip in society. This is a gradual process, obviously, in the early 90s, and it continues to this day. You also had globalization. Koreans couldn't travel. Most Koreans couldn't travel until 1991. So then Koreans started traveling abroad and seeing global society, global norms, global cuisines, and saying, why don't we have all this stuff? Started importing that, bringing that back in. And so these were two major change agents, I think, democratization. And of course, democratization means the end of authoritarianism. And society used to be incredibly authoritarian here. I like to tell people the first thing the first thing I saw when I turned on my TV in Korea was, I didn't realise what it was. It was a gangster movie. It was this big, chunky, slightly chubby guy with spiky black hair, I didn't speak any Korean at the time, growling at the TV screen, dressed in a black suit and a black shirt. I thought, what is this? He was a fashion icon. He was advertising a belt, Bando Belter. Yes. And in those days, that was what there was on television. There was the tough, macho, hard guy, or the cute, pretty housewife. And that was basically all there was. Said no diversity. Now, of course, things have changed radically because of this democratization, this internationalization, and other aspects, this competition you have in Korean society. But you've got men now are incredibly good looking here.
They essentially look like women. They're like on the posters, it's like, is that man or woman, or I don't quite know.
Yeah, I mean, again, there was no gender diversity, no sort of sexual diversity. Now, a lot of taboos are being lifted. Again, this is part of democratization, internationalization, and people can embrace different identities, cultural or sexual identities. But I think, the other thing is, people have decided quality of life is important. I want to look good. I don't want to be a tough, hard guy anymore. The sort of the gangster, macho guy is out of fashion because he represented the authoritarian figure that was very typical of military governance back in the 80s. Now people are much more, frankly, democratic, open-minded, and so people are much better looking, much more presentable than they used to be, and they don't necessarily have to stick to those certain roles. That having been said, there's still an enormous amount of groupthink here. I think people do feel compelled to meet social expectations, and that's one aspect of Korean culture that Koreans themselves in private complain about a great deal. There's enormous pressure from above and from around them to succeed and in some ways to conform to certain ideals. And of course that is also a great source of competitiveness.
Well, this energy that was expressed as such drabness and fierceness and grimness. So in this society you saw in 1989, I mean, was there any part of the society, of the city, of the culture that made you think, this is a place I could live 10 years from now?
10 years from now? No, I didn't really gaze into my crystal ball. I didn't see all the stuff that's happening now coming. And again, this didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual change. I think through the 90s, in the West, we went through this massive generational, attitudinal, cultural shift in the 60s. People started questioning their parents, what had gone on before. You had youth culture, youth fashion. And people started identifying themselves as victims and so on. And to a sense, I think that's what happened in Korea in the 90s. Again, you had people started, we don't want to look like our mother and father. We'll have our own culture. We'll do our own things. Part of that culture, of course, was traveling abroad. Part of it was becoming consumer culture rather than just a save culture. This whole idea of, in the 60s, you had women's liberation, you had black liberation, you had sexual identity liberation. All these things, again, happened in Korea in the 90s. And, of course, on the national front, that was when the anti-Japanesism started, because that had been suppressed in the 60s, 70s and 80s under the military governments who wanted good relations with Japan, because they needed Japanese investment and they needed Japanese technical licenses. By the 90s, Korea was going great guns pretty much by itself, and of course the lid was taken off a lot of information that hadn't been freely available before, and so Koreans again started really seeing themselves as victims, no longer of the authoritarian government, but looking back further, of the Japanese colonial government.
Now, even if it wasn't an appealing place to live in when you first saw Korea, was it a fascinating place for you to think about?
Yeah. I mean, one thing that hasn't changed is that Korea is an incredibly engaging place. I actually did go back I went back to the UK in the mid-90s to do a master's degree in Asian studies. I was that fascinated by the place. I wanted answers.
To what questions?
To all these questions. I mean, Korea is a place that back in the day, a lot of people hated it but couldn't stop talking about it. Now a lot of people love it and also can't stop talking about it. So one thing that has remained constant, when you meet a foreigner here, they all tend to have very strong opinions about Korea, albeit these days they tend to be very positive opinions, because it just is a gripping, exciting, changing and very engaging place. As an Englishman, of course, it's particularly fascinating because almost everything Korean is the opposite of everything English. British are told to be very, very calm, unemotional, with stiff upper lip. Koreans are very, very emotive and noisy and exuberant. For us, everything is all about rule of law. This is how we order our lives. For Korean, that's a very, very grey area. It's much more...
They don't adhere to abstractions in that way.
Absolutely, yeah. So for an Englishman, I think it's particularly interesting. The Koreans like to describe themselves as the Italians of the East. You hear this a lot here. That they see themselves as people ruled by the heart rather than by the head. And it makes it a fun place to be, and an interesting place to be as a journalist.
I've heard Irish as well. Irish of Asia. What do you think either has greater weight?
Yeah, I mean, again, the Koreans do sometimes call themselves the Irish of Asia. They have this free spirit. They also have this sense of having been very, very repressed colonially. Again, and there's some truth to that. Although, again, Ireland was, repressed by the Brits for hundreds of years. The Koreans arguably got off quite lightly with just 35 years of it. But yeah, I think both the Irish and the Italians, they're very different people, but they do have this free-spirited, emotive side to the national character. And that, of course, is a massive generalization. There's probably some truth to most generalizations.
No smoke without fire. But where and when did you start meeting the sort of non-fierce Koreans? Do you know what I mean? The ones who weren't putting you off with their spitting or the ones you could engage with?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't like to put a time on it. I think that the period of flux when you went from the very tough, driven, hard, hostile, fierce, bump into you in the street, spit on the floor, that behaviour was in a period of change throughout the whole of the 90s. To me, I think that the two signposts of the 88 Olympics and the 2002 World Cup, the 88 Olympics, Korea clearly had arrived as an economic power. But socially, it's a country that's still very, very rough around the edges. Politically, of course, it had only just embraced democracy. Whereas come 2002, you'd had... 14 years of democracy, you had people been travelling the world for over a decade, you were just starting to see the Korean wave, this huge sort of impulse towards creativity and pop culture and fun side of life was coming in. So I think people who came to Korea in 1988 were sort of impressed with it, but may not have really liked it. People who came here in 2002 were both impressed and were kind of overjoyed at the sheer fun and the exuberance of it. And so, to me, those are the two standout signposts in modern Korea.
What do you think of as a part of the Korean experience now for you that is just signaling something you could never have got before, something that would have been absent in the 2000s and the 1990s, something that is part of Korean life now, part of your Korean life now that just couldn't have been possible before?
I'll give you a few examples. I mean, we talked about my cats, makgeolli and makgeolli, okay? I enjoy beer, I'm not ashamed to admit it, okay?
We're all adults here, we can admit this.
Absolutely, children turn off now. When I first came here, the only drink you could get would be sort of a very, very poor form of makgeolli, and some really bad local lagers. Nowadays, you can get imported beer from all over the world. You can get some superb beers which are made in Korea, craft beers. This has been just in the last 3-4 years, I think. And also makgeolli is much improved, because makgeolli, as I said, when I first came here, you can only just get stuff that was made locally, and there was no competition. Both these things are driven by, I think, as I said, internationalization. People wanted better things. They'd seen better things in lifestyle. And deregulation, because what's happened was the government has allowed smaller and smaller breweries to operate. So we're no longer just beholden to a duopoly of massive brewers. On the makgeolli front, they deregulated these very, very old makgeolli laws, which said if you made a makgeolli, you could only sell it within your own province. So by creating a nationwide market for makgeolli, you created competition, and the people suddenly upgraded their game. And makgeolli became a trendy, popular drink. Again, so this is the changing trends in
many varieties here.
It's great stuff. If you haven't tried it, I highly recommend it. And likewise with beer. So this kind of answers both the things. It's democratization, albeit in the economy. It's no longer just the big boys who have the pie. And also, I think, in improving taste for better things. Lifestyle is much more important to Koreans now. And I think part of this is impelled by globalization. They've seen better things abroad and they want them here.
Right. There's a process where they realize that they realize the good things they already had. They had makgeolli. They probably had better makgeolli before than they did, in the 1980s. There's something about that. They see the rest of the world has good things. They want good things, and they realize maybe a bit later this is the next stage. Oh, we've got some good things too. Maybe we shouldn't forget about those.
Yeah, I think to some extent we're seeing. Again, the reason I came to Korea was for martial arts. Again, under the military government, the martial art was taekwondo, which is actually a Korean reordering of Japanese karate. Very few Koreans were prepared to admit that, but if you look at the history, it's fair and obvious. Whereas the original Korean martial art, Baekhyun, was not favored by the military regime and just was literally within one master of extinction. Again, in the 1990s, this important transformative decade, this one last master and his one student saw, Taekyon, this original Korean martial art, has a renaissance on university campuses. Young people start saying, do we want to do Taekwondo? What's the original? And it came back literally from two guys to now there are, I'd say, tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of practitioners. So yeah, same thing has happened in music to some extent. There's a lot of quite good neo-traditional music around now. We've mentioned the booze situation. It's not just makgeolli. There's all kinds of interesting, what we would call sherries, I guess, fortified wines. Bokbunjar is made with berries, very sweet, very pleasant. There's various ginseng infused herbal wines and so on, and these are all neo-traditional things. I don't know, I think they're based on old recipes which died out and are now being resurrected. So yeah, it's all good.
What got you into or exposed to Korean martial arts in the first place back in England?
I took it up at university. I had a minor talent for it. Became very interested in it. Also, I'd done a degree in humanities, which in the early 90s is not going to get you a job anywhere in sort of post-Thatcher Britain. So I was quite keen to travel, come out to Asia, and so it could have been Hong Kong, could have been China, could have been Japan. Right. The decider was, well, it's the martial arts. I've done the Korean stuff, so. Yeah.
Did you know other things about Korea before going, other than the fact that it was where this particular stripe of martial arts came from?
Not a great deal. I mean, there were Lonely Planet guides for travellers and backpackers, which weren't very good in those days. I think they've got a lot better now. There are a few books around about the Korean War, and of course we're aware that Korea was becoming the new Japan, although I'd heard of Samsung, I think. But at the time, not much information. In a sense, I think, as you've probably discovered yourself, Koreans are very, very well aware of the Korean brand. They're very, very interested in how their country is perceived overseas. And I think they do have a point there. I'm sympathetic to this because still, if you go to a bookshop in the UK or the US, you'll find something on Japan, you'll find something on China, you'll probably find stuff on Southeast Asia. But Korea is kind of terra incognito. It's been an information hole. And so I think the Korean wave has just been a godsend in that sense, because that's just driven a lot more interest into Korea other than simply industrial products, political strife, and of course, North Korea. Yes. I mean, I've just written a book, I should say, All That Matters, Modern Korea. So I had to ask myself, what does matter about Korea? So, I mean, basically it's from 45 onwards. Chapter 1 division and devastation, the war and its legacy. Chapter 2, the economic miracle. How did Korea go from zero to hero so effectively? And that's a tremendous story. Next one is the political miracle. Again, this tends to be overshadowed by the economic miracle, but Koreans by themselves, without outside assistance, which wasn't the case with the economic miracle, by themselves overturned decades of authoritarianism, and you now have a thriving democracy. That's a remarkable achievement and a pretty good benchmark for other nations in similar situations. Third chapter is what we were talking about a little bit earlier, the social miracle. How did Korea go from being this rather grim, miserable place to now a very cool, fun, happening sort of place? And then, of course, I got a chapter on North Korea and a final chapter on where's it going next. But what became abundantly clear to me when I sort of mapped out this was most of this is about South Korea, because South Korea is much more globally relevant to the world and for much better reasons than North Korea.
Yes.
But because North Korea is a dictatorship, it's got nuclear missiles, it's got human rights violations, most of the news coverage, most of the literature about Korea is about the North, not the South. And I think there's a certain injustice in that. South Korea's got a great story that deserves to be heard.
So it's sort of an artifact of the journalism business itself, isn't it? You know, it's when I was speaking with Daniel Tudor, who was the Economist's correspondent for North Korea. See, but the slip makes sense because he was the Korea correspondent, and I asked him what you write about for the Economist. He says, "Oh, North Korea, occasionally North Korea." And I mean, is that a pressure you have felt over the years as well? If you're writing for an outside audience, focus on the North because of its freakishness, or, I mean, the North is only so interesting, ultimately. It's pretty interesting for a while there, but once you know what is known about the North, you kind of know what's known about the North. I mean, the South, you know, as long as anybody lives here, they're always discovering new things, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, firstly, I thank my lucky stars North Korea exists because it's a great source of stories. The world is interested in North Korea, and for good reason. It is a dictatorship. They do have a nuclear deterrent, which arguably a nuclear threat. There are horrific human rights violations. Moreover, it's a bizarre, unique, very, very unusual country. And of course, it's run by the most bizarre living dictators on earth. They've moved from something approaching Russian communism to a de facto half-chosen dynasty, half-imperial Japan monarchy in just 3 generations. I mean,
that's on top of a vast black market.
On top of all kinds. I mean, the thing that irks me about North Korea is editors don't want the stories that matter. The stories that matter is that this is now a capitalist country, North Korea. People aren't really aware of that. They still see it as communist. It hasn't been communist de jure since 2009 when they struck communism from their constitution. And arguably it hasn't really been communist since, since the fall of the Soviet Union, the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe in the early 90s. So there's a lot of misperceptions and misconceptions about North Korea. But as I said, I think to me that the interesting stories, the human rights stories, that's a great and horrible human story, which does get told and is increasingly being told, but deserves to be told. But the other story is, the economic transformation and the massive black hole in our understanding of North Korea is, okay, well, we're going through this economic transformation. We've gone from a fatherly communist state to a pretty ferocious free market capitalist state in 15 years. What's this doing to the people's thinking? We don't really know what the average North Korean, if there is such an animal, thinks, and that's what makes it fascinating. Yeah. But again, editors tend to want stories about the latest silly rumor about Kim Jong-un, his giving away copies of Mein Kampf, or his ordered women to be executed, all sorts of bizarre stuff, which tend to generally turn out to be nonsense.
We wonder what's going on in the mind of the average North Korean, yes, but then it seems in the mind of the average South Korean, they're the only ones who don't really care about North Korea. It seems in the entire world, the people who least care about North Korea are South Koreans. Is that about right?
I don't know about that. I think you're probably overstating the case. I mean, you can't ignore North Korea. I think what surprises people and infuriates my editors back home is whenever there's a North Korean crisis, things here carry on just as they were. Even the markets, which are very sensitive to pretty much any international development, remain steady, even during nuclear tests and missile tests. Monitors are screaming, are the guys, South Koreans hiding in their bunkers? Are the air raid warnings going? No, not at all. Life goes on. They've lived with it for 60 years. Right. So people get blasé about the existence of it. And of course, we've now reached the point, sadly, tragically, where the generation which remembers North Korea, which has still got family members up there, is dying off and have very little political influence or political voice anymore. And the young ones, two generations of people have grown up now living with a divided country. It's accepted as normal. And it's a drastically different country. To the best of my knowledge, there are no two countries in the world sharing a common border with such a massive disparity in incomes. And what makes this doubly bizarre is they're the same people.
Right. They are the same people, and it's a conversation.
They were the same people.
Yes. I guess they haven't been so apart so long that genetic drift has made them into completely. I don't even know. I don't know how long that would take, but it's not. A space alien couldn't necessarily tell a North Korean from a South Korean. I'll put it that way. But of course, the divide seems stark to us. And foreigners will say among themselves, it's a common conversation, it seems to me. What are you going to do if Reunification Day comes? You're going to go up to Pyongyang? You're going to, I was asking Daniel Tudor, you're going to open another branch of your pub in the Pyongyang if you can? I think he probably will, or would. But South Koreans, you ask them about reunification, the answer is never straightforward. First of all, it's like, well, I wouldn't use the word reunification. I would prefer it was gradual over the course of 50 years. And answers that seem to mean they don't want it to happen at all. Has that been your experience talking as well?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a good question to ask. And, the answer tends to be, firstly, disinterest. Secondly, a bit of fear of the unknown. Right. But I think, President Park, to her credit, and Lee Myung-bak before him, did try and raise this issue during the Sunshine Policy, which was 10 years of left-wing rule. The general belief was it is way too expensive for us to reunify with North Korea. We can't afford it, so we've got to come to a modus operandi. How are we going to live with these people longer term? Now I think there's a sense that, well, maybe unification would be a good thing, so we have to tell the South Korean people why it would be a good thing, and there are many good reasons. Firstly, South Korea stops becoming a de facto island.
Yeah,
you're now you're reconnected to the Asian mainland. So you have rail, pipeline, and road access to Eurasia, which is great. You've got access to 23 million cheap labourers who you keep behind the DMZ, which becomes a customs barrier rather than a border. You've got some natural resources. More importantly, you've got to rebuild an entire nation from the ground up, and Koreans have done it already here in the 60s, and we know they can do it. They've got a blueprint, they've got the companies who'd love to make that investment, going to generate a huge amount of money, and you've got the last undiscovered market, or unexploited market in Northeast Asia. Every North Koreans will want to have, hot dogs and Coca-Cola and Psy DVDs, right?
Sure.
So
they've got those. They're just pirated from China.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's part of the change we were talking about just now. What do these people really think? So long term, it's a fantastic thing. I think I occasionally meet investors who come here and want to have a chin wag, and they've been spoken to the guys at the ministries, and the ministry paints this very rosy picture. Everything we've just spoken about, plus this will be a spur for Northeast Asian regional integration, because the casus belli disappears. We spend less on the military, we spend more on more productive things, and so on and so forth. Very, very sunny uplands indeed. What frightens people, and what is the big problem here, is how do we get from A to B? Because the achievement of some form of unification carries with it these just absolutely colossal risks. Collapse of the North Korean regime, chaos, civil war, invasion. If in any of those scenarios, if we, i.e. the South Koreans and the Americans going from the south, the Chinese come in from the north, we meet in the middle, we're back to November 1950, all over again, Korean War. There are nuclear weapons in the mix. Right now, I don't see any prospects for reunification. I think it's as far away as it's ever been. It's been a long way away for a very long time. But the thing about Korea is it does surprise people. And tomorrow, when we wake up in the morning, North Korea will probably be there. Likewise next week, next month, next year, and so on. But there may come a time when there will be some crisis, an existential crisis, for a country which, let's face it, has thus far managed to resist all the tides of political and historical trends. But can it last like that forever? Most people will say no. So the question is, if that is the case, when's it going to happen? And I don't know anyone who's able to predict it's going to happen this week or this year or next year or in 20 years or in 50 years. No one really knows. So it could be a calamity.
There's, when I think about the elements of Korean history, the aspects of Korean history you've written about, and I think about some of the conversations where I've had with Koreans where there's a lot of it they just don't want to think about, often with good reasons. But there's other elements. I mean, it's a standard thing that comes up in expat conversations here, but that the idea that maybe Koreans aren't the best stewards of their own past. Is that something you've encountered much, that conversation?
Well, I think it's not just the Koreans. My sense is right now, in Northeast Asia, across the region, history is a vehicle for nationalism. That's the way it's taught, that's the way it's instilled. It's not designed to seek knowledge for its own sake. It's not designed to tell interesting or fun stories, albeit we do see that in the film and television industries, the historical soap operas and so on. But the way it's actually taught and the way it's, I think, very deeply embedded in the national psyche of Koreans, both sides of the border, and Chinese, and to some extent Japanese, is the government's telling you how to think about things in the past. So there's a lot of things you simply don't learn. For example, we were just at the Japanese embassy. There's a poster there of An Chung-gun, who is the famous independence activist who shot Hirobumi on the platform of Harbin Station, in 1909. What Koreans don't learn is that Hirobumi was the last member of the Japanese elite at that time who was against the colonization of Korea. He was the last living softliner, pretty much. He had been in favor of the Japanese having a protectorate over Korea, which means basically controlling Korea's foreign relations. But he was against colonization. So when he was assassinated, he was sort of the last high-level opponent of colonization. So I think it's perfectly reasonable and fair for Koreans to applaud An's brave, selfish action. Here was a man who clearly put his own life on the line to kill who he considered an enemy of the country. What they're not taught, of course, is the fact that he probably got the wrong target.
Right.
And of course, in Japan, he's seen simply as a terrorist, which again is a very blinkered view, which shows no empathy with the Koreans' position. So it's not just the Koreans who are doing this. I think it's across the region.
I mean, is there some sense that if Koreans in school learned that the truth was slightly more complicated, that would lead to the fall of South Korea somehow?
I mean, I don't know about that, but it is a strong element. There's as we know, Korea's democratized, it's globalized, it's liberalized, but there still is this very, very strong force of nationalism. My daughter goes to a Korean school, and it was the anniversary of D-Day, 60th anniversary, 70th anniversary of D-Day just a few weeks ago. And I said to her, this is Normandy, Hannah, this is what happened, a major 20th century event. No, I've never heard of it. I said, really? And she sort of rolled her eyes and goes, but Daddy, I really know a lot about Dokdo. So that's, that's
You probably had a fair few classes related only to Dokdo.
I didn't actually go into that much detail, but yes, I believe they do. And there's, this is no secret. The Koreans are saying we need to educate our children more about Dokdo and about the colonial period and about the comfort women, which basically is another way of saying we need to raise their distrust and or dislike of Japan.
I wonder if there's any. I can't think of a nation that I feel like I was made to distrust growing up in America. You get a lot of junk in American education, but I feel like I wasn't, my rage was never being ginned up at anything. Like, how about in England?
In England, God, I mean, I don't think so. Our traditional enemy is France, but most Brits actually love France. Yeah, it's a lovely culture, lovely lifestyle, lovely food and drink, quite nice people on the whole. I think in America, of course, it's more of an ideological thing. It's like those goddamn Reds, the commies, or...
I'm not quite that old, but...
No. Well, no, indeed. But I mean, I'm not talking in history. I'm talking just in popular culture.
Yes.
Watch any movie with Sylvester Stallone in it. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think most countries probably have an interesting relationship with their past colonial overlord. A Korean who lived through the colonial period, who, like many Koreans who actually lived through the period, is less anti-Japanese than the modern Koreans, said to me, I've spent a lot of time in China and Korea and Vietnam. And in Vietnam, the Vietnamese get on fine. They've got no issues whatsoever with the French or the Americans because they defeated them in war.
Right.
Whereas the Japanese and the Chinese cannot stop bashing the Japanese because in 1945 it wasn't they who defeated Imperial Japan.
Right.
I think there may be some truth to that. So I think there's still a sense that be you Chinese or be you Korean, we need to keep fighting the Japanese and beat them, even if it's only in the International Court of Public Opinion or Public Relations.
Now that I think about it, maybe it's just the era I grew up in, but I feel like history in school in America is pretty self-flagellating. It's always about what evil white men did. You know what I mean? Which is itself a bit of it's a thing about history or teaching anything. We had this program when I was growing up. It may still be around, despite its demonstrated ineffectiveness. It's called DARE, Drug Abuse Resistance Education. And a plank of the education, quote unquote, was that they would literally say all drugs are equally dangerous. Even a 10-year-old knows that isn't true. If you say that, no matter what your intentions, everything else is also going to be ignored. Like, okay, fine. If that's how you're going to play it, I'll just play my Game Boy all day in class. Then, it's like you introduce that one thing, and especially talking about history, you sort of as soon as what the point you tried to underscore too much gets revealed as an exaggeration. I mean, you lose everything else too, right? If information you're trying to convey.
Yeah. I mean, my sense is that most Koreans, the ones I meet, just don't give a toss about Dokdo. They've got no interest in it. But there's enough very emotive, high-profile people in whose vested interests it very much remains to keep this issue alive, that it's become a pillar or a plank almost of the national narrative. I think this is one of the issues in Korean society. Right now, there are some issues that you literally just can't argue against. The debate is 100% one way. And I think, the whole Japanese thing is there now. No one is prepared to take a rational view. Let's talk this through. Let's try and be reasonable. There's much more political or social capital to be made in being anti, and again, joining the emotive bandwagon rather than bringing rationality into it. But that having been said, I think, for example, the comfort women, some of them are still alive, and they've told their stories, and they're staggeringly tragic human stories. So that kind of history, I think, grips people, because the victims are right there. They really are some of the victims of history. And I think that's the kind of story which, Koreans will react to. Whereas, as I said, Dokdo, it is an issue in politics and in the media, but I've yet to meet a Korean who really cares about a pair of rocks.
Yeah.
I should add that I think history is taught badly. I'm a historian myself in most countries. I mean, it can be a very, very dull subject because you take out all the blood and the fire and you just add in all the stuff that's designed to glorify your nation. All you end up with are dates, places, names, and
one damn thing after another.
One rather dull thing after another, and none of the blood and guts of history, which is what you really want to learn about. In the UK, we've got this incredibly popular children's series of books now called Horrible History, which are literally just about the nasty, horrible, bloody bits of history. In Korea, that tends not to be taught because, as I said, history is part of the national narrative. It's the glorification of the country, unless, of course, we're victims of the Japanese, in which case thrown as much blood and guts as you possibly can.
It reminds me of an observation that was almost just an aside, well, more than that, in Michael Breen's book, The Koreans, whom I interviewed here in this office a few weeks ago. But he said about history, learning about history from Koreans, asking Koreans about Korean history, tour guides, books, what have you. They can give you dates and names, and they can give you the number of bricks in a palace, but it never coheres into a narrative.
Story. Yeah, I mean, the classic example, go to the palaces. The palaces here, they've been burned down by Korean slaves, there have been murders, poisonings, rapes, all kinds of fascinating stuff went on their grounds, and it wasn't just the kings who lived there. They had concubines, they had eunuchs, Who wanted to become a eunuch? What was the surgical procedure? How many concubines did the king have? What was their lifestyle? How did they live? All these kind of fascinating issues are completely unaddressed. You go to a signpost, it'll give you a name, a date, and it'll literally give you dimensions. This is so-and-so meters tall, and so-and-so meters wide. They don't tell the stories.
I remember going to the Dongdaemun Design Plaza, the new, very striking building, and where they unearthed some ruins, and they're in the middle there now of a fortress. And it's literally just the dimensions of the bricks and stuff on the sign. Like, it tells you literally what you're looking at. Like, nothing that your eyes don't tell you. Yeah,
it's completely unnecessary, redundant, extremely dull information.
So why don't they make a narrative out of any of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question I've been asking. For one thing, what happened in Korea is, and comes back to everything we're talking about, from the 60s to the 80s, this was an authoritarian country, and the narrative was a top-down one. This is what we have. Then in the 1990s, particularly under the liberal governments, a lot of that narrative was rolled back, and then you had this strong ideological fight between right and left. That's when anti-Americanism really rose in populace. There were questions about, was Kim Il-sung such a murderous villain to start the Korean War, which is what we were taught for 30 or 40 years? Maybe he was a patriot, and so this unleashed a storm of different opinions, which is not a bad thing. But of course, it becomes extremely sensitive, and I think it became very difficult for government departments, be it people putting signposts in palaces or producing textbooks, to actually come up with anything other than the basic names and dates, because they'd be accused of being left-wing or right-wing. The exception, of course, being, again, the sort of the anti-Japanese stuff, which everyone has to agree upon.
Yes, it's like asking Korean people I meet about, I don't know, what's a historical subject, King Sejong, the commissioner, inventor, what have you, of Hangul, the alphabet here, and they'll know that. They'll know an array of other random facts about him or that era. And then it will sort of turn into a discussion about how much easier it is to write Hangul than Chinese or Japanese. Like, it just slides toward that.
History is taught with the express purpose of glorifying the nation, rather than drawing deeper currents of thoughts or even learning interesting or entertaining stories.
So it falls to foreign writers then to make the narrative, such as yourself.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. But, no, there are some very good Korean writers doing this kind of research. Just I'm not sure if their research is reflected in school textbooks or signposting, government websites, and so on. There's some very good historical novelists here, and of course there's a massive audience for historical melodramas. Yes. As a historian, I kind of find these a bit laughable. Just look at them, they get it all wrong. The lighting is too bright, the clothing is too bright, everybody's rich and well manicured, and you get no sense of
the teeth alone.
The teeth alone is all wrong. But, that doesn't change the fact that people want to learn something about history, because there are interesting stories embedded in history. But of course, the only way to bring it alive to the young generation seems to make a melodrama out of it, which is sad. That having been said, there are good historians in Korea. I've met a few. I'm just not sure how wide a readership they reach.
So when you're putting together a book like All That Matters on Korea, what's something that is important for the Korean neophyte to know to contextualize everything else? What are the qualities of Korea that you think that someone should know first just to get everything else in order that they will be experiencing here, that they will find out? What are the most basic planks of knowledge about Korea today?
Well, I think I tried to break this down sort of thematically, and the themes are slightly chronological. And you've got the nadir of modern Korea, which was after the colonial period, the country is divided, and then it's virtually devastated from north to south. Mm-hmm. And of course, the country is a basket case, and yet half of the country rebounds, beyond anyone's expectations. So you've got an economic miracle. Koreans talk about it too much, but they're not wrong. It really was a miracle. Miracle is not a bad word. Then you've got the political miracle. Now you've got what I'm interested in talking about, particularly, I think Daniel is too, this kind of socio-cultural miracle we're undergoing. So those are sort of the thematic stroke chronological things. What you need to know, I think, is Korea's, the basics of it, the location. It's a small country. In Western Europe, it would be a mid-sized power. In East Asia, Korea, given its population, is literally a shrimp between the whales. Yes. Again, this is overstated, but it's absolutely true.
The 39th biggest state in America, too, like 39th to the bottom.
Yeah. But if that state was set between Japan on the one side, China on the other side, and the Russian Far East on the other side, it would be pretty weak and very much somewhere that could be either a terrible victim of history or somewhere which could make a great deal out of history by becoming a crossroads. And of course, Korea now wants to become a hub in the region, and I think becoming a service center for northeast China is very feasible now. It's not a bad future for Korea. So that is geographical stroke, geopolitical stroke, geoeconomic location is important. I'm not sure you need to learn the 5,000 years of mythic history or the sort of 2,000 years of recorded history. I'm not convinced that stuff has an enormous impact on Korea today. I think you need to know what's happened here in the last 100 years, the standout events, what I just mentioned, plus the opening up of Korea. Basically, you have a medieval kingdom founded 100 years before Columbus discovered America, being forced open to the world at the end of the Victorian era in the 1880s. So a real time capsule suddenly is opened to a very, very new world. And if you read the journals of the early missionaries and travelers and traders who came here, they were just goggle-eyed at what they could see. It was a real live medieval Asian dynasty. And of course, so you go from that to colonialism, to war, and to the rest of it. And I don't know any other country on earth, there may be some, where history and change has accelerated so quickly as in Korea. And it hasn't finished yet. The story remains unwritten because we still have that mighty challenge, which is unification or not, hanging over our heads.
What artifacts, what effects of the acceleration, of the speed of the change of Korea, what effects of that do you notice in your day-to-day life? The fact that it has gone so fast, how does that manifest itself just when you're out in Seoul?
Let's talk about it in economic terms. We've already talked about the social change. I think if you're a foreign businessman, you come here and you look at the hardware here, i.e. the buildings, the infrastructure, the technology, the stuff you can see with your own eyes. You think, my God, this is a super advanced place. This is like New York or London. But the software is not quite the same as us. In the same way that North Korean communism was never the same as Russian communism, South Korean capitalism was never really the same as Anglo-Saxon capitalism. Wow. It's a very different animal indeed, imbued with different practices from the past, different aspects of the local culture, and of course social culture I'm talking about, rather than temples and Buddhism and so on. And so what you see is not necessarily what you get. The hardware and the software, there is a mismatch. It's a different thing. And Koreans, although increasingly, I think, as people. They have the same beliefs, attitudes, aspirations as we do as North Americans or Western Europeans. They do have a very different social culture, and that's a different prism through which they view the world, and it's important to try and understand that.
I mean, the hardware and software is one thing, but occasionally the hardware fails too. I mean, they point out that a building collapses every 10 years, or a bridge, or the Seoul sinks. I mean, it's why did it take up until now for Koreans to start reflecting on maybe we have a problem?
Well, I don't know if it did. I mean, these disasters started sort of accumulating in the mid-90s. Again, this transformative decade. And again, I think that is the hardware-software mismatch. Koreans are very good at building stuff. They're great metal bashers. They're great constructions, great engineering. And they've built stuff from some of the world's highest buildings to bridges, across the world. They're not bad at it. They're bad at it in Korea because the local culture requires them to pay off certain officials who then overlook certain safety measures. You then have a relationship with the guy who's meant to be regulating your project. He doesn't really do his job properly, and so suddenly a bridge collapses or a ferry capsizes. It's the hardware-software mismatch again, combined with the rapid speed of development, this incredible accelerated change where some of the regulatory systems and safety systems and mindsets, processes, didn't really catch up with the speed of development.
Now, do you hope for more of a deceleration? I mean, is that coming?
Good question. I mean, one thing you'll learn very, very quickly in Korea, it's one of these terms that every foreigner learns, is pali, quickly, hurry up. Everything in Korea is done much faster than, say, it is in the UK. In the UK, if I want to do anything bureaucratically, it'll take hours, days, or weeks. I recently went to get my international license here, thinking it'll take a couple of hours. I got it done in 10 minutes. In the UK, I'll be, looking at a week minimum, So Koreans are used to doing things fast. Right. But I think, it's time to slow down. In some senses, that's already happening. Macroeconomically, the growth rates have slowed dramatically. As Korea becomes more developed, you start to plateau. I think socially, Koreans need to calm down a bit, slow down, start enjoying life more, and that's happening. There's a slow food movement. There's more interest in quality of life. But take away the pali, and you're going to face a very different Korea.
And finally, what are your favorite things to drink in Seoul today?
Didn't we already answer that?
Well, we mentioned the genres you have drink you named your cats after, but what are the beverages you savor the most, especially if you couldn't get them before?
I'll tell you a few locations if some of your readers might want to come here. Daniel Tudor, who you spoke to, runs a nice little set of bars where they have microbrewed beer. Bill's Pale Ale, which is brewed by a friend of mine, is a very good session beer, and it's I'd say a world-class beer made right here in Korea with Korean water and Korean brewers. Good stuff. I would recommend try to get to a makgeolli jib, a makgeolli shop or makgeolli house. There's a place very close to my office here in Dokdo called Sanchez Makgeolli. He has about 20 different makgeollis from all over the peninsula and really superb food. He's one of these very creative young Koreans who obviously didn't want to wear a suit, didn't want to work for a chaebol, didn't want to be a doctor or a lawyer, and is just a really creative, very, very good chef running.
What must his parents have said?
Never asked him. Any Korean who calls himself Sanchez is, you got to admire that, and for no good reason either. He just likes the name, And I also suggest, when you go to restaurants, and Korean cuisine is great stuff, particularly and a lot of it's actually quite accessible. The barbecue is not too threatening. There's no taste there that'll blow the roof of your head off.
But if you hope for that, you can find it.
But if it's not difficult to find. There is some pretty idiosyncratic, some very spicy, and some, explosively tasty things here, but that's not for beginners. Start off with the barbecue, with the jun, which are the pancakes. These are fairly accessible. I think anyone can pretty much eat them. If you're going to that kind of some upper middle class restaurant, try bekseju, which is a fortified wine with ginseng in it. meant to be very healthy. I don't care if it is or not. I just like the taste of the stuff.
They have a lot of rationale for what's healthy here. And what's
They do. They
Fried chicken, health food.
Or pork belly, healthy. Yes, take that whole well-being thing with a pinch of salt, and literally sprinkle it with salt.
It's not healthy. Provided for you.
It's not healthy, but it tastes good. Try Chongha, which is the rather like Japanese sake. It's a rice wine. Try Bokbunja, which is this berry wine, like a berry sherry, I suppose. And if you're a man, it's meant to be great for you. They say if you drink a bottle of this, you'll be able to explode the porcelain in the toilet bowl with your urine stream. Stamina food, yeah. What else? Yeah, that's it. But to me, as I said, I would say drink Korean beer. And Korean beer is now, there's two kinds. One is the traditional beer, the makgeolli, which is rice brew or rice ale, and the up-and-coming microbrews, which are British, Belgian, German, North American style beers being brewed here by young Koreans.
Do you find now that Korea has everything you need?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going on vacation next week to the UK and France. 10 years ago, I used to just, for months, I'd be dreaming I'm going to eat curry, I'm going to eat pizza, I'm going to have a good ale and stuff. Yes. These days, you can get all that stuff here. So, as for an international person, Korea's, at least Seoul, has become very, very globalized, and there's not much I miss now. Fish and chips, English roast.
Renditions of fish and chips here.
Yeah, I mean, English cuisine hasn't made it to Korea, but pretty much everything else, I can't think really what I miss.
And it seems so far from my trip here, I could agree there's not too much Mexican food, maybe. It's coming along.
There's a few good places, Mexican. I mean, I've reached the point now, if I'm in the UK or France for more than 3 weeks, I'll actually want to have Korean food.
Indeed, that I can believe. That's why I live in Koreatown in Los Angeles, and I hope for a Mexican food miracle as the next miracle of Korea, which is the country my guest today has written very much about, all aspects of it, with more to come, and a book that'll be out by the time you hear this, which is It All That Matters on Korea? Am I getting that title?
All That Matters, Modern Korea. It's published by Hodder Dalton in the UK, McGraw-Hill in the US, and it's designed to be the dummy's guide for smart people. So if you're either a dummy or a member of the intelligentsia, you're catered for with this book.
Andrew Salmon, thanks so much.
Thank you.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to all the backers of Notebook on Cities and Culture's Korea tour on Kickstarter. Adam Hartzell, Aidan Nullman, Alfred Lee, Andy Cooney, Angus Gordon, Bala Chenupati, Cam Smith, Chin Music Press, Dan Caraselli, Danny, Deborah Smith, Emmett Farragher, Umberto Grant, Ian Plosker, Ismail Kennedy, Jackie Gast, Jay Chang, Jeffrey Davis, James DeVito, Jonathan Filbert, Josh Paget, Kimberly Hahn, Manvir, Mark Hines, Matthew Workman, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Monica Eck, Michael Fransky, MJ Pritchett, Patrick O'Flaherty, Patrick Park, Piers Rippey, Robert Salzberg, Samuel Hansen, Sean Brown, Themistocles Chakrisis, Thomas Unterberger, Timothy Dobbs, and Wayne Wright.